This week we brought the Antiques Roadshow to Scotland. Just 10 miles or so south of Glasgow, we're in Motherwell. Until 1850, this whole area consisted of tiny villages, forests and pasture land in the valley of the River Clyde. But that rural idyll was shattered by the roar of the steel furnaces. From the middle of the 19th century, Motherwell became the centre of the Scottish steel industry, the fiery glare of the furnaces lighting up the night sky. Steel made here became the basic raw material of the Clydeside shipbuilding industry, and hundreds of vessels went down the slipways built of steel made in Motherwell. Now, with the steel furnaces shut down, all that's left is a memory kept alive here in the Summerley Industrial Heritage Park, where they preserve the sights and the sounds of industry in this part of Scotland over the past 200 years. The River Clyde has always been the lifeblood of the area. It doesn't really much matter whether you're talking about shipbuilding on Clydeside or steel making in Motherwell, but it's also been an artistic inspiration. Turner came here in the 19th century to paint the magnificent Clyde River Falls, and Wordsworth stood not far from here as he wrote, "And yet how fair this rural scene, for thou, O Clyde, hast ever been beneficent as strong." Hardly surprising, therefore, that this part of southwestern Scotland is so popular among tourists. Despite the recession in the local steel industry, Motherwell boasts a modern civic centre, and that's where we've invited the people of this part of Scotland to come to meet our experts.
Anybody who comes to Glasgow area would love to find a chair looking like this. One of the design icons, I think, of the 20th century has to be the furniture made by Charles Rennie Mackintosh. How did you come by it?
We found it in a junk shop.
In a junk shop?
I was at art school myself and realised that it was a Mackintosh style.
Right.
And thought I must have that.
Right. Did you pay a lot?
No, we swapped.
You swapped?
Yes.
For what?
Dreadful candlesticks.
I'm sure they were dreadful candlesticks. They weren't wonderful.
Absolutely, yes.
Right. And one has to say, of course, that Mackintosh was a designer. He didn't actually make things himself. Now, the traditional chair, as I think you know, is actually taller than this, and the high-backed chair was the most characteristic object of the Mackintosh style. This is shorter, but it still has a lot of Mackintosh characteristics. As I say, the way the back is assembled is right, the way the vertical elements are taken right down underneath to join in the back, this double dowling on each side. These are all characteristic elements. It needs further research. I'm trying to convince myself, as you can see, that this is actually a Mackintosh chair. Based on the fact that you paid very little for it, I think we have to say that you've done quite well. Now, to begin at the very best, which this isn't, a really good top-grade Mackintosh chair now would sell for 8,000 to 10,000 at auction. Don't get too excited. Work down, because until one could establish exactly the provenance of this, you're probably still dealing with low thousands. If it is simply a Mackintosh-style chair, rock bottom of sort of 800 to 1,000 pounds. So, unless the candlesticks were fantastic, I have to say you've done very well.
Two splendid pieces from what must be an extremely impressive service. How much more do you have of it remaining?
We have 76 pieces now at home. There was a lot more.
Mm-hmm. You use it, I hope?
We use it at Christmas time, especially.
I can imagine the turkey on that. Mustn't it?
Yes,
very
we
splendid.
do.
That's
we do
right.
have the turkey.
Really was made as a service to you originally. Was this something that's always been in your family?
Well, it's my husband's family, actually. It's made for the family.
With the design very typical of the 1840s, probably we're looking at. It's as English as can be, though one wouldn't have thought so. The patterns of a Chinese vase, peony flowers, they're a mock oriental theme, really. But the material is very heavy, so when you've got a pile of plates, they must be quite heavy. Hence the name Ironstone. So what sort of pieces have you got?
We have dinner plates, supper plates, tea plates, soup plates, and we have one or two the smaller urns, for...
But there was more originally. How big was the set?
We believe that it must have been about 200 piece, but unfortunately my mother-in-law, some of it got lost in my mother-in-law's.
Lost?
Yes.
So what's happened to it? How do you lose a dinner set?
Well, actually, it was... people came to the house saying they were antique dealers, and they took away quite a number and gave her £40. There's nothing we could do about it. The police said the fact that she accepted £40 and she wasn't well at the time.
It is such a way. There's a natural assumption that piles of plates in a kitchen cupboard can't actually be worth anything, and one sees so often that services do get sold off thinking they're valueless. But £40 was probably, that's only what, sort of 30, 40 pence a piece, isn't it? If we worked it out. But we look at what you've got left, which is 76 pieces. You must be sort of a big dish is going to be easily a couple of £100 alone. Obviously, when you've got a tureen like this, which would have had a stand and with a ladle as well, is going to be further sort of £300 or £400, and at £40 a plate for the ones in good condition. I mean, we're easily there in sort of £2,000 or £3,000 for what you have, which is so one sort of a word of caution. What can happen to the rest of the sets?
Oh, yes.
But use them. But
well, we do use them
and enjoy using it. Very nice to see it. Thanks.
Well, these are a fascinating group, aren't they, David?
They really are. If you were on the tour in the 1820s, say, this is sort of typical of what you might well purchase from a local artist at the time.
Yes, instead of sort of seaside postcards in a way. I mean, you've got these wonderful views of, and we think they are probably Vesuvius. It's various stages of the eruption, and the top one here is when it's just beginning to below flames, and then working downwards.
The condition is good, eh?
They're wonderful. They're in gouache. Yeah. But I think the main thing is the wonderful quality of them. They really are very, very, very nice.
Yeah.
Have you had them a long time?
About 30 years.
30 years, yeah.
How old would it be?
How old?
Well,
we reckon, what, sort of 1820s?
About that. They've got to be around that.
Yeah, they're difficult to date in a way, and they're never, very rarely are these ever signed, are they? They're always very anonymous, so you never quite know who did
I don't
them.
see any signature on them at all.
No, but that's normal in a way. They normally aren't. But I think they're very nice. I mean, I don't know what they're worth, but I would think, what, £300 each?
About that, yes.
Maybe even a bit more, because they are particularly nice sets. They're quite rare. And I mean, I don't know whether perhaps insurance, even £500 each would do.
Yes, about that, yes.
Yeah, but they're very, very beautiful, I think. They make a lovely, lovely set.
They're nice in the wall.
Certainly not a fake. In fact, it has all the desirable features of a pretty little late Georgian, William IV period table. Nice slender legs, this lovely sort of moulding around here, very pretty block, and then this nice wasted column, and everything about it is fine. It's a bit of a tragedy, though, that, you know, these are starting to come off
I've
here.
actually got all those pieces.
You've got all the pieces?
It's actually just come off because my mother had a very cold house. So I think with the drying up of our flat at the moment, it's just dried it up.
Right,
And it's actually come
okay. How long has it been in your house rather than her house?
About a year.
Well, I wouldn't do anything to it at the moment. I mean, because it's quite likely that some more bits will drop off before it's finished.
Okay.
Sadly, I mean, the one beautiful part about the table, which was the top veneer, has gone through not misuse, simply a weakness in the design. The top veneer was unstable compared to this timber, which was the carcass. That shrank, and the veneer started to chip away. So better take it all off and polish the top. You can tell that definitely by, if you look underneath here, they actually veneered underneath a quarter of that so that it didn't look odd. It showed exactly the same timber, even when it was down. And the other thing is that they certainly would have done that if the top weren't to be veneered. And here you can see where the shrinkage has been compensated for by this additional slip, and on your side as well. And you can see the exposed heads all the way around where the screws that fix the hinges actually have caused those little holes. When it was veneered, it didn't matter, but as soon as you take the veneer off, they are exposed. So, although you've got a nice table of that period, as I say, 1825, 1835, it has lost a lot of the potential commercial value. But as a family piece, it doesn't matter. It's still worth £2,500.
Okay.
All right?
Yeah.
Here we are looking at an Edison phonograph. Tell me where it came from.
Well, I acquired it about 12 years ago from a family friend who knew we were very interested in this sort of thing. I'm keen on old 78s, and it's very good at playing them.
I can see here it says a B19. Now that's the model number. And the B19, which was originally marketed as the bungalow model, first started out in 1919, so it's post First World War. The bungalow model, the name didn't go down too well, so very quickly they changed it to the chalet model, which seemed to meet with more success.
Yes.
Oh, that's nice. Well, let's have a go with those afterwards.
They're all
Got some gramophone records
They're
here.
all monologues, Stan Holloway monologues.
Oh, well, that'll give us something to laugh about in a minute. That will be great, thank you. So yes, the chalet model, produced from about 1919 through to, I think they finished in about 1923. It's made of red gum, which is an unusual choice of wood. And in fact, when I first saw it, it looked much more like mahogany. It was one of the first machines, if I can just take the front off here, the fret, that had this concealed horn inside. So what we have is a very good quality machine. It has an interesting way of playing because it tracks in a parallel way, doesn't it?
Yes,
with most
rather than
machines,
pivoting.
exactly, most machines have a pivot and we're used to the needle going inwards on an arc. Now value, even though they were produced and were sold at quite high prices, some of the more complicated and decorative models, they don't seem to have really increased that much in value. So yes, today a machine like this would be worth between about £400 and £600. But I'm sure it's worth a great deal more than that to you, and I hope it continues to give you a lot of pleasure.
We do get a lot of pleasure from it.
Now I want to listen to it. What have we got here? We've got the Toreador song, or Even Bravest Hearts. Which is the best side for this?
Perhaps the Toreador are a bit more dramatic.
We go get it lined up.
Well, in the 60s, we lived in the Lake District in Kendal, where the auction sales were absolutely wonderful.
Right.
And we used to be able to get lovely pictures, lovely frames for about an old shilling each,
So
or
these
less.
cost you roughly a shilling each, were they?
Probably less.
Probably less, my goodness.
But
Amazing.
this particular picture wasn't in this frame. I simply married them up with a bit of humble cardboard behind the watercolour.
Well, it's by William Evans of Bristol, and it's a view of Carnarvon Castle. And if you look very carefully here, you can just see W. Small M. Evans, 1850. Very, very pretty example of this artist's work. Any idea of the value?
None at all.
Well, today at auction, that should make between about 700 and about 900 pounds.
That is more than I'd expected.
Splendid. But what about this?
Yes, that was the very top. Sit.
Right, give us a demonstration.
Oh, you're supposed to put the stuff in there and you blow it.
Now, moving on to this other buy for around a shilling or so, but of a later period by Charles H. Poindexter, and it's signed, inscribed and dated Jersey, 1882. It's not often you see his work coming up at all, so comparative rarity. Value-wise on this one, around £1,000, £1,200. So those purchases in the 60s for a shilling or two, well, very, very good investment indeed. And thank you ever so much for bringing it to the show.
Now tell me, where did you find this wonderful thing?
It's been in the family for about 75, 80 years.
Yes.
My grandfather bought it, but it was second-hand then, and beyond that, I don't know, can't trace it.
Right.
Beyond that.
And he bought it, what, because he liked it, or because he was a
Yes,
great drinker?
because he
or-
liked it, and no, he was actually teetotal himself.
Really?
Yes, he
So
bought it.
it was never used?
It was a conversation piece, and it was left to my uncle. And I used to go and visit him, and every time I would go, he would go and get your glass, and I would come upstairs and get one of those, and he would give me a glass of Benedictine.
Ah, so it did actually have a
It
use.
did, it had a use, yes.
I mean, what is remarkable to me about it is that it's all complete. You've got the nice cut glasses, you've got the decanters, which of course should be filled with the best malt, single malts. And if you are a teetotaler, or if you prefer to have something else after dinner, you can open the bottom and lo and behold, here is coffee set up before the meal, and there it is ready. It's very nice group of wares for serving the coffee. Elegant pot, and with a very nice plaited handle, little knob on the top. Very good, well-made pieces. I think it dates to the early years of this century. There was seriously a great revival in 18th century style at that time. And the Adam style, the Hepplewhite style, all these came back. And while they did reproduce existing pieces of furniture, they clearly invented new styles and new shapes for pieces of furniture that didn't exist in the 18th century. Right. I mean, you may remember perhaps when televisions first came out, they were often concealed in wooden cabinets.
That's right.
And this was very much the same idea. Had there been an 18th century drinks cabinet, I think this, with its wonderful rise and fall action, is exactly what they would have made. Now, I've never seen one complete with all its bits. We're talking about 80 years old, very nice woodwork, beautiful graining, beautiful finish, all the sort of correct Hepplewhite details in a very revivalist way. I think I would certainly go to sort of £300-400 for it, perhaps a bit more.
Sick.
Because it's such a wonderful thing, and the pleasure of it, I couldn't resist it. If it was mine, every evening I'd come home and have another drink.
You know what this is?
A bass.
Drain pipe. Not quite, but on the way. You like it? It's a fascinating story, really, and it does hinge around drain pipes. There was a firm in Lambeth in London called Dalton's, and they specialised in making spirit flasks and gin bottles and that sort of thing in this material, which is salt-glazed stoneware. This is a clay. You take it up to a very high temperature, about 1250 degrees centigrade, and at the last minute you shovel in salt. And the salt volatilizes and sticks all over it and produces this shiny glaze. And Henry Dalton inherited the family firm, and he came up with this bright idea, and that was to make drain pipes out of salt-glazed stoneware. The great thing about it is it's very tough. It's impervious to alkalis and acids, so you can bury it in the soil and nothing happens to it. And he made a fortune. Anyway, Dalton decided he could make artistic wares out of this drain pipe material. So he set up a factory in Lambeth, and he got students from the Lambeth Art School to come and decorate it. And they were given a completely free hand, which was very rare in Victorian times. And there were some very skilled people who came off that, of course. There was George Tinworth, the two Barlow sisters, Hannah and Florence. Now, the two Barlow sisters, they had an agreement that Hannah would stick to animals and Florence would do the birds. And this is one of Florence's pieces. And there's her mark on the bottom, F.E.B., Florence Barlow. We've also got the Dalton impressed rosette mark. We've got the person who did the extra work, not this decoration. And we've got what appears to be a date. What does that say?
1887.
1887. 1887, golden year. Year of Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. And unfortunately, it's not in good condition, is it? What's happened to it?
My dad was moving furniture in his car. It made me get...
Your dad did it? Don't talk to him ever again. It was a great shame, because it's a really very nice pot. That could be cleaned up and done rather better, but as it stands, it's worth about 70 to 100 pounds. So it's still worth quite a lot of money for a cracked pot. I'm glad you brought it in. You glad you brought it in? Good. Thank you.
I've had it over 40 years.
You
myself.
Personally?
Myself, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And who had it before then?
My father.
And?
My father's father, I presume, yes.
Oh, so it could very likely have been bought new in the family,
yes.
And you've had it ever since?
Yes, yes.
Well, that's very interesting.
Yes.
It's a pear-cased watch. We call it a pear case because it has
Pair.
an inner...
Yes.
Yes, a pair of cases, as you say. Nice set of hallmarks there. 18-carat gold.
18.
Hallmarked in London in 1806.
1806. Mm.
So, did you think it was quite that early or not?
I didn't think it was as early as that, no.
No? Well, let's see where it's made. Have you ever opened up the thing before?
About once.
Once, well. Nice quality watch, just looking at it. We've got a dust cap there that comes off. That just protects muck from getting into the movement.
Yes.
And then it's signed there, Robert Green of Edinburgh.
Ooh.
Well, I think he was working roughly from the sort of 1780s through to the 1830s. I know he was there for sort of 45, 50 years.
Yes.
So quite a prolific maker. You'd expect seeing a watch like this of this sort of date for it to be a verge. This is in fact a cylinder escapement, but very much rarer than the verge at this date.
I see.
So a good quality early 19th century watch, as I say, assayed in London, retailed by this Edinburgh maker. And in the sale room at the moment, you'd be unlikely to get that for less than about £800.
800.
So you must insure maybe £1,100–1,200 for retail replacement.
Oh, I see.
So a nice thing to have been handed down, and I hope
Yes.
that you're going to keep it in the family and hand it down too.
Many thanks indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, now to the second part of our tea competition, in which you have the opportunity of winning a voucher to the value of £2,500, which you can then spend on antiques of your choice. And there are 3 additional runner-up vouchers of £500 each. And every week I'm joined by one of our experts to tell us more about antiques associated with a long tradition of tea drinking. This week, David, some rather unusual pots.
Yeah, I mean, we've got this long history of tea drinking in England. In the 17th century, pots were very small because tea was £300 a pound, and it was that expensive. In the 18th century, they were very influenced by contemporary Chinese ware, like this Worcester example of about 1770. In the 19th century, they went completely berserk and produced some of the nuttiest pots ever. This wonderful Majolica one from about 1870.
Great fun, isn't it?
Terrific fun. Early in the 19th century, we get this form of pot, which is actually based on a Chinese wine pot. This is brambled with a Rockingham glaze. It's rather amusing because there's apparently no way in apart from the hole in the spout. The secret lies in the base, and there's a tube that goes through this hole up there. You pour in your ready-made tea in through the hole, and when you invert it, of course, the tea doesn't fall out.
So no problem with tea leaves.
No problem.
And you don't need to stop it.
And you don't need to stop it. It's very clever.
Which leads us to our question, which English lady gave her name to this type of teapot? Well, next week, the last question in the series, and also more details of how to enter the competition. In the meantime, back to our experts.
Anybody interested in the 1930s always wants one of these wonderful motor car teapots. Now, where did yours come from?
After the sad loss of a friend, I
Yes.
was given it from her house in July.
Had you admired it before?
Yes,
or
I had admired it.
You'd always liked it?
Yes, I always did like it.
Right, and yours?
Mine was given to my parents for me when I was born by another elderly lady.
An extraordinary present for a child.
Yeah.
And did you always like it and look forward to it?
Oh, yes, yeah, loved it.
Right. I can tell you that these teapots have close relatives in the form of a railway locomotive, a tank, a gun, a whole range of bizarre things made by saddlers of Staffordshire in the 1930s. But the most famous and the most collectible is always the motor car. Sporting, lively, all the style of the 1930s seemed to be expressed by this. I presume people did use them. One has to take it seriously. This was a teapot. It does work. There are nice refinements in the two. They are slightly different. There is more silvering on the wings of this one. Perhaps this is the deluxe model. You never know. Have you ever made tea in it?
No.
I'm disappointed you don't use them. I'm sure it pours out a very racy cup of tea. They're a great thing. This is a wonderful piece of, if you like, Art Deco nonsense. And a price today for a good one of these, depending on where it's sold, ranges between £150 and £250. And all it is just to make tea. It's a wonderful sort of summary of English, the English sense of humour. Nobody else in the world, I think, could make something quite so ridiculous as this. But anyway, you're very lucky to have them. I wish somebody had put one aside for me.
Now, this is very nice. A nice sweetheart heart. Can you tell me anything about it?
Only that it was my grandmother's.
So your grandfather bought it for your grandmother?
My father.
Oh, your father?
For his mother.
I see.
Yes.
And then obviously he was in the First World War?
Yes, he was.
In the Suffolk Regiment. These things are so personal, and people kept them on their pillows with the absent soldier in mind. And in auction, they usually fetch something between £50 and £100. It's so nice to see.
I'd love to show everybody how it actually tells the time, but there's no key here. How do you actually alter It's obviously a long story, is it?
I got in my husband's toolkit and I produced this.
It's much easier to pop down to your local jewellers, and for £3 or £4 you can buy a little key that will set these hands. But meanwhile, let's just have a little look. If I can, I'm holding that. There we are, the minutes around this one. And on the other side, you'll see the other eye moving, I hope. Initially, they were all carved from wood. This is actually a bit of a copy. This is, I think, plaster or something like that. What did you pay?
£4.
Well, I think you've done pretty well, because had he been in wood, I think you could safely have said 250, 300. The fact that it's slightly later and in plaster, take it down a bit, but it's still a great object.
Do you know whether this is a buffalo or a bison?
We've always called it a bison. It belongs to my mother. It was her father's before that, and when he died, my grandmother came over to stay with mother from France.
So there is a French connection in the family?
Yes.
Oh, well, that's interesting. I would think it dates from about 1860, 1870. Most of the Animalier bronzes were signed, but this one is not. The Animalier were a group of French artists working in the 19th century, specifically doing bronzes of animals. Their main inspiration was a man called Antoine Louis Barry, who was born in the late 18th century and was working mainly the first half of the 19th century in Paris. Animalier bronzes are collected, but their value has remained fairly level over the last decade or so. If this came up at auction, I would expect it to fetch somewhere between £600 and £800 perhaps. And if you were buying it in a shop, you'd pay maybe £1,200–1,400 for it.
It's a very pleasant surprise.
Gold lorgnettes?
Yes, it is.
They're quite strong, actually. Do you still use them?
No, never.
No. They've been in
given
the family?
to me, yes, by my grandmother. Then my mother had them, and now, well.
So they've gone through the family,
yes,
what,
that's
since
right.
the late 19th century time?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
You are French?
Yes, I married a Scotsman. Yes, and I've been over here for 46 years.
Well, as I say, they're very much made for a lady's use.
Yes.
And they're very dainty and very pretty. And what's nice is that the lenses themselves are the original lenses that were put in at the time of the piece's manufacture, which I think, by its very, very sort of pretty, fussy style, means that they're French.
Yes.
Probably around about 1875, something like that. But the condition is excellent, and obviously you've looked after them and kept them very well all the years that you've owned them.
That's right.
I think if we look carefully, we'll probably see that there's a little French control mark, just to tell us that it is French, because it's so obviously the French design. In fact, if we have a look there, you can just see a tiny little impression that's been stamped onto the ring at the bottom there. Well, that's the little French control mark.
Yes.
So as far as its potential value is concerned, I think that if they were sold in an auction, they ought to make around about £500 to £600. For retail replacement, to actually insure them, you really have to look now at around about £900, £950.
So you just brought this in now? I mean, on a van or something?
I just put it in a van. I moved it up with Strasser and there, she said. Hey. So I've moved that with me now. I've moved it. So that's moved there.
You should move in it, couldn't you, really? It's big enough to move into. Well, we'll have to see what we can say about it. I don't know, goodness gracious me.
It was given to my husband as a present on the death of his friend. It was his favourite painting.
I think it's marvellous. And we have a work by a Motherwell painter, Roy Young Ferguson. Painted probably in the 40s, perhaps. Slightly faded, watercolour, over pencil outline. Some sort of influence, I say, by Picasso, wouldn't you?
Yes.
I see that, in fact, that it's slightly slipped in the frame.
Yes.
So we've got the signature half hidden.
Yeah, fell off the wall, I'm afraid.
Did it? Oh dear. Well, I'm glad it doesn't get damaged.
I was out at the time.
I just wondered as to how much it's worth.
Well, I like it more for a picture than anything else.
Well, that's nice to hear you say that, actually. Today at auction, around £1,000 to £1,500.
Surprising.
Where's it been?
The line of shed. Lying in a shed for about 15 years, you know, on and off.
Lying in a shed for 15 years. And all the patina's gone, all the colour's gone. Look at the top. You've been stripping paint on here. Unbelievable. Well, you know, we're laughing at it, but I mean, it's an amazing piece of furniture. You haven't got the top part, have you?
No, no.
Because you see all along the top there. And in some
I know where it's lying.
What?
I know where it's lying.
You don't? Really?
Yeah.
Well, get it. I mean it. Because if you got the top to that, it changes it from half a nice piece of furniture into an important thing. Most of these are machine carved, but this one I'm convinced is a hand carved one. It smacks of the Warwick School of Carving, which started in about 1850, 1860, and it was the craftsman's answer to machine carving, which became popular after 1847. They were done in Belgium and in Italy, but I think this is an English one, quite certain of that. And I'd put it about 1870, 1865, 1870. But it is a very important example. I think it's very brave of you to stick it in the back of a van and hump it along here. So, where did you get it from? I mean, how did it didn't just appear in your shed?
I was painting a dairy for a farmer and he just says, take that away.
I just gave it to you?
Well, for doing the painting, you know.
And you've been mixing paint on the top of it ever since?
No, he wanted a place painted, so that was it. He said, do you want it? I said, I'll do that. He said, well, paint that then.
And all it wants is a nice wax. It wants a good rub. You could soon get some patina back in that. Or wax on there. That's right, absolutely. And that would start to look like bronze, and you'd start to give it a bit of colour, and it would come to life. And polish the top is easy. A little wax on there would look really good, and would start to look like what it's really worth, which is probably in the region of £3,000 or £4,000. And with the top, up goes the price. Really, I mean it. This is a seriously interesting piece of furniture. This came from a very important collection, somewhere.
There's been a line about
Yeah, absolutely.
It's really just for dress, just dress, really.
And your bonnet, your ostrich feather bonnet?
Yes, it's
Has it got a hackle in the side?
I've got a hackle for it as well.
What colour, white?
A blue one.
A blue one?
A blue and white one.
And your ski and do, is that hallmark silver mounted one, or?
No, it's just a
straightforward.
Just a straightforward ski and do.
Because I've seen all types over the years, you know. I mean, presentation ones and very elaborate ones, of course.
I've cut a few haggis with it.
Yes, I bet.
I've been to a few burn sippers and I use it to, when I'm addressing the haggis, I take it out and do the business on the haggis with it.
Well, they belonged to my grandfather, and he was very interested in Scottish paintings, and he bought them all.
Yes. What sort of date do you think he bought them? Any idea?
I think round about the 1900s, 1900 to 1912. So,
yes,
yeah.
Around that period. Well, you probably know that the majority of these pictures in this gallery, I should call it, are by members of the Glasgow School, the Glasgow Boys. And they were a group of artists who sort of formed together in the 1880s in Glasgow. Some of whom had already been rejected by the Glasgow Arts Club in 1877. And so they came together in about 1885, and they started holding exhibitions in Glasgow. And initially they weren't terribly well received. And it wasn't until really a little bit later that people in Glasgow began to realise that actually there was a bit of talent here, and they started to get very enthusiastic. The first artist we have here is, as you probably know, is Edward Atkinson Hornell.
Yes.
And this is a wonderful picture by him. And he's interesting because, in fact, he was born in Australia. Did you know that?
No, I didn't.
No, he's born in New South Wales in the 1860s. And he came to Scotland as a child. And one of the interesting things about him was that in 1893, financed by Burrell, he went to paint in Japan, and some of his best pictures are from that period. Now this picture, as you can see, is dated 1912 on the right-hand side, is not from that period.
Yes.
So it's a little bit later, but nonetheless is a really, really very fine example of his work.
It's the only one that we know how much my grandfather paid for.
Yes, how much did he pay for this?
£75.
£75. Well, it's worth a bit more than £75. I would think that in today's market, you're talking about something in the region of between £30,000 and £40,000, really.
Good grief.
Yeah. No, but I'm serious. It's a really lovely...
Wow.
She has rather a cheeky grin, which I think people would like.
Let's see what Beatles talc smells like. Does it smell of Beatles socks, I wonder? Let's have a look. Sort of ode a Beatle. Well, actually, it doesn't smell of anything at all. I think all the smell's gone. What's nice here, you've got a picture of the Beatles, probably shot in the sort of early 60s, and then photographs on the back there. Now, there were a lot of bits of Beatles memorabilia produced, but this is quite an early one. It got its license on the 27th of November in 1963. It was made in a limited number, and it's early, and it's in good condition, and it has some talc in it, even though it doesn't smell of anything. So the value would be something between perhaps 80 and 120 pounds, which is an enormous amount of money for a tin of talc made in 1963. Isn't it extraordinary? Yes.
The next one here is by Alexander Roach, and is of somebody called Jenny, and I'm afraid I don't know who Jenny is. Do you know who Jenny is?
No, I don't know anything.
And he was an artist who learnt his trade really in France, and then he came back to Scotland and started painting with Guthrie, and was one of the leading lights in the Glasgow school. Do you know what your grandfather paid for that one?
I don't know anything.
No. I would think it's probably worth 3,000 to 5,000, between 3,000 and 5,000. Okay?
Yes.
Now, we go on to the next one, which is, and this one is by Constance Walton, signed at the bottom right. It's a very beautiful watercolour. Do you know anything about her?
I think she was the wife of E.A. Walton.
Correct, absolutely right.
Yeah.
And he is obviously better known, and he's one of the original members of the Glasgow school.
Yeah.
But I think it's particularly nice quality, this, and I've never seen any work by her of this calibre before. And again, it's wonderfully fresh, it's been behind glass, hasn't been exposed to too much light, and it's a very fine thing. And I would say, you know, again, we're looking at somewhere between about 3, 4, maybe even £5,000 for that.
Wow.
3 to 4 anyway.
Yes. I didn't realise it was worth that much.
And the interesting thing, that is in watercolour, that one, whereas the other two are oil. And then moving along to the fourth one, this is by James Patterson, who is, again, well known. And in a way, this, to me, reflects the influence of Arthur Melville, who is a wonderful artist, Arthur Melville. Do you know him? Who is, again, a leading light in the Glasgow Boys. And funny enough, I think it was last series, we had a particularly beautiful Arthur Melville watercolour, which a colleague of mine, Peter Nahum, did. And he painted in North Africa, and it was a beautiful sort of Arab market. And this particular work by Patterson reflects very much that style of painting.
Yes.
So we're probably looking at about £2,000 to £4,000 for that.
Wow.
Okay?
Yes, yes.
Right.
What happened here? This is obviously a new fracture.
So I tried to remove one of these metal things that was on the wall.
I thought as much. That's one of the great problems, because these are very highly sprung, and they do tend, unless you take them off very carefully, they tend to create this sort of damage. This is 220 or 30 years old, and it's been survived quite well up until recently. We won't discuss the price, it's really worth very little now. But this one we've got here, it's made at Davenport, and it would have been one of a set of maybe 12 plates of a dessert service. So it's meant to be seen in a cabinet. That's, again, suffered the fate of damage very early on. See this one, it's got these fairly awful, prominent rivets down here. What they've done is they've simply drilled little tiny holes either side of these cracks and then married the whole thing together with these rivets or staples. But that completes the set. It would have been an incomplete set without this treatment. Anyway, it's quite illuminating, so thanks for bringing them in.
Okay.
I really like this one. Do you like this one?
I'm not sure. It looks as if there's something slightly out of balance in the picture. It's,
well, I rather like it. I like the bees,
The
and
bees
I
are
suppose
good.
is that apple blossom, cherry blossom? I don't know, but it's by David Murray, and he's really best known as a landscape painter. It's really very beautiful, that, I think, and it is unusual, but it's highly decorative. Perhaps a bit too sentimental for some, but anyway, I like it, and I think it's worth 3,000 to 5,000 again. Okay, and then finally, this really is the odd one out because it has no association with Glasgow Boys, or for that matter, the Glasgow Girls. But this is by an artist called Harlamov, and Harlamov is a Russian painter, not surprisingly, who I think not all that much is known about him, but I think he did in fact come to work in the British Isles and painted. I mean, there are an enormous number that come up for auction, and both in America and here. And he really, I must have seen a lot over the years, but they're always this type of subject matter. It's always rather pretty girls, pretty women, very competent painter. And in fact, this girl I've seen numerous times being depicted. And you'll be amazed to hear that about not very long ago, there was a Harlemoth that sold at auction, I think up in Glasgow. And it was bigger than this.
Yeah.
It was bigger than this, and it was two girls, but it made £140,000. So, you know, I would reckon that something like this must be worth £30,000 today. So,
yes.
What you have here is the most fantastic collection, really. I mean, they really